Hello, History of Sexuality students, and welcome back. As you know, this week our focus is on AIDS, specifically the first decade of the AIDS pandemic in the United States. During the 1980s, HIV hit gay men harder than any other demographic group. Of course, it is impossible to know the total number of gay men who either contracted HIV or died of AIDS. Nevertheless, it is clear that at the epidemic's height, gay men suffered the most AIDS deaths by far. One study has estimated that by 1995, 1 gay man in 9 had been diagnosed with AIDS, and 1 in 15 had died. Another study found that AIDS death caused life expectancy rates for gay and bisexual men to drop considerably, down to 54.3 years. Taken together, these figures add up to an incredibly sad, unsettling fact. AIDS effectively decimated the gay community. A significant part of an entire generation was lost to this terrible disease. But of course, AIDS did not completely destroy the gay community. Far from it. From the very beginning of the epidemic, gay men fought the disease, the stigma surrounding it, and the government's negligent response. How did they grapple with this horrific, deadly disease? How did they make meaning out of it? And how did their activism impact the United States' more general approach to AIDS? In what follows, we'll address these and other related questions. As evidence of HIV's sexually transmitted nature mounted, one of the first things gay Americans had to wrestle with was their own sexual practices. From the early 1980s, a debate over promiscuity erupted among gays. Some called for major behavioral changes, like Larry Kramer, one of the most vocal advocates of partner reduction as a preventative strategy. Echoing this, a pamphlet by Michael Callan and Richard Berkowitz called "We Know Who We Are: Gay Men Declare War on Promiscuity" took aim at those gay men who, in the author's words, quote, continue to deny overwhelming evidence that the present health crisis is a direct result of the unprecedented promiscuity that has occurred since Stonewall. They went on to say as follows. Not everyone agreed with this. In response to Kramer's writings, one critic attacked him, saying that, quote, Kramer's ideology springs from a profound contempt for sex. This disdain enables him not only to condemn those who are sexually successful, but to devalue desire itself. Others attempted to chart out a more moderate course, as can be seen in this 1982 advertisement in the New York Native. From these ideas emerged the concept of safe sex. This promoted greater use of condoms, alternatives to anal intercourse, and also having sex with a smaller number of partners. Instead of encouraging men to stop having sex altogether, the idea behind this was that people just needed to have sex safely. And rather quickly, the idea caught on. In doing so, gay men successfully fought off broader cultural attempts to pathologize their desires and behaviors. They also managed to extend the legacies of the sexual revolution into the age of AIDS. Indeed, the success of the safe sex message ensured that the ethic of experimentation that spread during the 1970s was not entirely abandoned. Despite the spread of HIV, many gay men continued to believe that gay sexuality and gay sexual health were compatible. The era of gay liberation, in other words, was not over. As Amy Hoffman, editor of Boston's Gay Community News, wrote in 1983, one of gay men's achievements over the past decade, which I as a lesbian and the entire lesbian movement have been challenged by and learned much from, has been the exploration of the experience and meaning of gay sex and pleasure and love. We must resist the feeling that AIDS means that this exploration, this path to liberation, was wrong, and we now have to abandon it. This feeling comes from homophobia. Haven't they always told us we are sick, sinful, and disposable people? Instead, it is more important than ever that we continue to explore our particular sexualities, our bodies, our lives. In refusing to succumb to pathologizing, stigmatizing mentalities, activists demonstrated some of the ways that the gay liberation movement of the 1960s and 70s continued to reverberate into the 1980s. But this does not mean that AIDS had no impact on gay community organizing. Among the most notable changes was the development of an explicitly medical arm of gay activism. Given the federal government's indifference to the plight of people with AIDS and rampant discrimination in the healthcare sector, such a development is perhaps not surprising. It began on January 4th, 1982, when gay activist Larry Kramer and a group of 6 other men founded an organization called Gay Men's Health Crisis. During the first 6 months of 1982, the group raised $106,000, an impressive amount of funds for an organization that held its meetings in the basement of a welfare hotel in Manhattan. From the very beginning, the group's goals were threefold. First, education, that is, issuing publications that inform the public about HIV and AIDS. Second, services, which included things like an AIDS hotline, programs designed to help people with AIDS obtain financial support from governments and foundations. And third, advocacy, mostly pressuring government agencies to conduct research and improve healthcare. In its work, the Gay Men's Health Crisis came face to face with the stigmas and phobias that accompanied people with AIDS in their day-to-day lives. From the very beginning, the group's hotlines were overwhelmed with calls, and most of these revealed just how difficult it was for gay men with AIDS to receive adequate care. As an example of this, consider the memory of Robert Ceci, the group's ombudsman, who recalled as following. By the mid-1980s, GMHC was handling about 500 cases per year. Yet, despite its success, a number of gay activists grew dissatisfied with its work, in particular with its somewhat paternalist patient-client orientation. Seeking an alternative approach, one that would empower people with AIDS and encourage them to practice self-determination, new groups started to emerge. One was Gay Men with AIDS, which was founded by activist Michael Callan. In 1983, Callan gave testimony to Congress explaining the various forms of discrimination that gay men with AIDS faced in their day-to-day lives. A key moment in the growth of the AIDS community was the 5th National Lesbian and Gay Health Conference, which took place in Denver, Colorado in June 1983. This led to the formation of the famous Denver Principles, which began as follows. We condemn attempts to label us as victims, a term which implies defeat, and we are only occasionally patients, a term which implies passivity, helplessness, and dependence upon the care of others. We are people with AIDS, or PWAs. After the Denver conference, a number of attendants returned home to form the PWA Coalition. Its bylaws drew attention to what was unique about this group. People with AIDS are the experts on the subject of the epidemic, the paper read. The group created a publication called Newsline, whose purpose was to encourage PWAs to take control of their lives. Newsline quickly went on to become the AIDS community's first regular source of written information. By 1987, circulation had reached 14,000, and readers came from all across the country. Its contributors talked about good and bad experiences, they shared information about meetings, they talked about policies and programs, and they offered information about treatment. Most of the information was practical: how to find a doctor, how to manage the illness, reasons to join a support group, tips on grieving, etc. One of the biggest goals was to counter the widespread view that AIDS was a death sentence. In the final years of the 1980s, gay activists began to adopt a much more confrontational approach to AIDS. Whereas Gay Men's Health Crisis had mostly performed insider work that focused on lobbying, fundraising, and advocacy, in the late 1980s, there was a notable shift toward outsider strategies and toward protesting and public demonstrations. This shift was fueled by a number of things, including 1. Rising numbers of deaths, 2. a sense that the government was failing and negligent. 3, a belief that traditional forms of activism simply were not working. And 4, hopes inspired by promising new treatments. As a sign of the times, in the mid-1980s, one activist observed how, quote, "The time for candlelight vigils mourning the deaths of our lovers and friends is over." The organization that most embodied this new, more militant style of activism was a group called ACT UP, which stood for the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power. It began in 1987 and was primarily concerned with promoting the rapid release of anti-AIDS drugs. ACT UP was a quasi-guerrilla outfit whose tactics involved public disruption and extreme protest. While controversial, these methods produced results. For evidence of this, one need look no further than the group's activism around AZT. AZT was the first promising drug in the treatment of HIV, and it was sold under the name Retrovir. It was initially developed in the 1960s and had a similar structure to HIV, which is why clinical trials were begun in 1985. The drug was developed by the pharmaceutical company Burroughs Wellcome, and it was far from perfect. Among other things, it was toxic to bone marrow, and it was generally only effective in the early stages of AIDS. It was also incredibly expensive. At $3 per pill, annual cost per patient could run as high as $10,000. But because it was the first promising anti-HIV drug, it generated a lot of hope within the AIDS community. By 1986, 3,000 PWAs had been enrolled in clinical trials for AZT, but many were angered by the fact that these experiments required some of them to be given a placebo. Believing that the decision to withhold a promising drug from patients with a life-threatening illness was morally unacceptable, members of ACT UP engaged in direct action protest against the Food and Drug Administration and the National Institutes of Health. As Larry Kramer, the group's founder, put it, quote, "The delays that are keeping these drugs from us are not scientific. They are bureaucratic." I'll allow you to read the rest of this excerpt yourself. AIDS patients believed that bureaucratic barriers were effectively consigning them to death. The solution, as they saw it, was to get the FDA to modify its approach to drug testing. Speaking out against the standard review process, the AIDS community believed that once a drug's safety was proved, patients should be able to choose the level of risk they would undergo. In this, they were successful. Intervention by ACT UP convinced the FDA to speed up its review process, and as a result, AZT was approved after just 108 days, compared to 760 for most drugs. In addition to this, in 1987, the FDA expanded its compassionate use rule, which gave drug companies the ability to provide patients with unapproved treatments so long as the data could be gathered by the FDA. The procedure was expanded in 1987 with the creation of the Investigational New Drug for Treatment category, which allowed companies to charge for drugs that had been approved for safety but not for efficacy, so long as no alternative treatment existed. And in 1989, Anthony Fauci, director of the National Institute of Infections and Allergic Diseases, announced the parallel track, by which individuals ineligible for clinical trials and unable to take approved medications would have unapproved medications prescribed to them. This data could also be used to support drug approval. As all of this suggests, despite facing rather grim odds, the gay community had a tangible impact on America's response to AIDS. Just as they had changed the psychiatric profession's stance on homosexuality in the 1970s, they succeeded in transforming medical and public health responses to AIDS in a way that ultimately served everyone's needs. As a result, the gay community came to own AIDS. But what impact did this have on gays and lesbians themselves? For this side of the story, we'll have to turn to our assigned readings for this week. But before we get there, let's think about the following questions.